Hey, how's everybody? This is Aaron Rosaria again, your fearless leader. All right, as you can see, I'm in my office once again. Um, we are going to walk through together the answers to this week's reading questions on Chapter 8, The Principle of Avoiding Killing. Once again, I have provided a written version of this material as well. Hence, if you get tired of my voice, you could turn this off and just go look at the answers I have typed out. As always, feel free to email me any follow-up questions, and I will once again be posting a discussion board question uh, as a follow-up, and those will be due Monday night. All right, good times. All right, so let me share my screen, and we're just going to walk through the questions, and I'll give some explanation for each of the answers. All right, cool. All right. So hopefully, and I believe you are, you're seeing chapter 8, the principle of avoiding killing, and the only difference between your reading questions and this document, of course, I've filled in my own answers. Okay. All right. So let's just proceed. So our first question pertains to pages 152 and 153. The question is, can the general prohibition against killing an innocent person always be explained by the principle of non-maleficence? Now, if you look down at my answer, first we'll define what that prohibition is, then we'll define the principle of non-maleficence, and then we'll answer it. So the general prohibition against killing an innocent person states that it is always wrong under any circumstances to kill an innocent person. The principle of non-maleficence entails that a physician should always avoid harming their patient. And by harm, it's kind of a flexible term. It can mean causing them pain. It can mean damaging a part of their body that they might want to actually use later in life. Um, so those two would be the biggest. One cannot always use non-maleficence to justify not killing an innocent person. And here's a couple of examples in Part B, and that's what Part B asks for. For example, some patients are in a permanent vegetative state, which means their higher brain's functioning is completely shut down. They're not dreaming, they're not conscious, they're literally not aware of anything. And they're never coming back. That's key too. It follows that they cannot be harmed in the sense that's relevant to non-maleficence. So again, to pull the plug on such patients so that they will die would not involve causing them pain, nor would it involve destroying any part of their body that they would want to use in the future because they're permanently in that vegetative state. Um, Another common case would be, what about patients who are in extreme pain that cannot be relieved, that is due to a terminal illness? You wouldn't want to say you need to avoid killing them because you'd be harming them, because intuitively you'd be killing them to relieve their suffering. So you'd be killing them so less harm would happen to them. So if you were to um, commit what is called active euthanasia, the deliberate killing of a patient, the whole point would be to relieve suffering, reduce harm. So it'd be maybe an abuse of language to say the point would be causing harm. Okay, so that's the idea there. Um, Now, at least in American bioethics, there is a long tradition that's changing rapidly now, but historically, even something like the active euthanasia of a person in great pain who only had a few months to live, that was seen as intrinsically wrong, no matter what pain relief benefits accrued to the patient. And again, that's actually in flux. It's changing through a lot of discussion and a lot of argumentation. But a lot of people have held to this general prohibition against killing an innocent person historically. Okay, and many do at present as well, of course. It's still being debated. All right, and then I had you quickly define a couple terms, foregoing treatment and extraordinary means. So foregoing treatment refers to either the withholding of treatment or the withdrawing of treatment. So for example, a cancer patient could decide to never accept chemotherapy to begin with, or they might stop using it if it is not effective or if it's too painful. My phone's ringing. We're going to ignore that. Now let's just pause for a second until it stops ringing. All right, it's done. All right, good. Um, yeah, and this ties into our discussion about avoiding killing. Again, this is never keeping the patient alive at all costs has never really been the goal of medicine. Doctors treat that which is treatable, and when an illness is untreatable, they often are content, and along with the patient, of course, to let the illness take its course. Okay. All right. Question 2 directs us to page 154. And the first question is, what is the difference between killing a patient and letting them die? And then question B is, which one is the more controversial course of action? So killing a patient involves actively taking their life. For example, in states such as Oregon, it is legal for a doctor to prescribe poison to a terminally ill patient who has repeatedly requested aid in dying. Letting a patient die involves not taking steps to prolong a patient's life and letting the disease kill them within a briefer time frame. So down to B, many people think killing a patient is morally worse than letting a patient die. Or another way of phrasing that would be to say many people think killing the patient's wrong, but letting them die is morally permissible. Um, but like I said, this is changing, and it's changing through argument. So it's not just a shift in culture. More and more people are exposed to arguments in favor of active euthanasia, and those arguments are compelling to more and more people. All right, let's look at question C. C says, now, what the authors are doing, they're looking at arguments in favor of the view that killing a patient is morally worse than letting them die. Um, and they start out by looking at a couple of bad arguments in favor of such a view. Okay. Um, so we get to question 2C. Why can't the argument killing the patient feels intuitively to be morally different than letting the patient die be trusted? And more specifically, it often feels worse. The reason this can't be trusted is that a person's moral intuitions or the felt sense that an action is wrong is a very fallible guide to moral truth. For one thing, our intuitions or felt sense of right and wrong are shaped by the ideas of right and wrong we have grown up with within our culture. And some things can seem right and other things can seem wrong just because that is how we were told to think and feel about them. This is not a sound replacement for exploring moral arguments for and against something like active and passive euthanasia. So to take an example outside of medical ethics, just think of so someone in my generation is far more likely to have grown up simply being taught same-sex relationships, that there's something wrong with them. So by the time you enter adulthood, you might have this feeling, oh my gosh, there's something wrong happening there. But then you engage moral reason You look at the happiness and the quality of those relationships. You look at the deprivation experienced by people attracted to the opposite sex or gender when they're deprived of those relationships. And then you realize, okay, my moral intuitions here can't be trusted. Okay. And then the next generation, maybe they start off with different enculturation. Uh, so it's good for every generation to explore moral arguments for and against a view. Um, Again, feelings are important, but they're not the best guide to moral decision making. All right, let's look at part D. Question is, okay, two arguments are given against the argument that since actively killing is almost universally legal and letting die is almost universally, um, oh, sorry. Actively killing is almost universally illegal, and letting die is almost universally legal, that the latter is morally better than the former. What are these two arguments? All right. So the main one is this first part here. Let's see if I can highlight right here. One can't resolve a moral dispute by simply accepting the majority view. Hence, even though it has been legal in many more cultures to let patients die than it has been to actively kill them, with consent, it doesn't follow that the latter is more ethical. Legality and morality are not identical to one another. Um, yeah, so let's say a tradition has built up and is caught on even cross-culturally. Um, it doesn't follow that that tradition's correct, right? You still have to look at the arguments. Mere majority view is not a great argument in favor of a particular course of action. On a secondary note, the authors note that allowing the active killing of patients, oops, there shouldn't be, there we go, is gaining traction in more and more countries. Hence, the disparity is not as great as it used to be. But that first point's the main point. Um, Majority does not decide morality. Um, Even our laws, we often challenge our laws on the grounds that they're unfair or immoral in some sense, or just harmful. So we morally criticize what is legal all the time. So that's another way of seeing that legality and morality are not the same thing. Okay, question 3. On pages 156 to 157, there's a section entitled Consequentialist Arguments for and Against Distinguishing Active Killing and Letting Die. Okay. So, again, the question is, morally speaking, is there something wrong with actively killing, but morally permissible with letting die? Are these different morally? Why? And we're going to look at some consequentialist considerations. That's arguments based on the consequences of each one, that there is a difference. All right, so question A, when active physician-guided euthanasia or active physician euthanasia was legalized in the Netherlands, did the number of people killed this way greatly increase? In part B, did the Dutch physicians do a good job sticking to the regulation that only a terminally ill patient who persistently, in other words, over and over again, and explicitly requested euthanasia be granted help in dying? And the answer is to A is yes. The number of people killed shot way up. It went from about 400 a year. So there used to be a much more restrictive set of conditions under which a physician could help a patient die that allowed about 400 a year. And then it jumped to 2,300 a year. And part B, the Dutch physicians did not do a good job sticking to the conditions under which actively euthanizing a patient was declared legal. In about 1,000 of the 2,300 cases, they did not wait until the patient had repeatedly requested to be euthanized. And another regulation was that they had to be declared competent to make such a judgment. Now, this would be an argument against active euthanasia on the grounds that the doctors are going to do a bad job sticking to the guidelines in place, and more people are going to die than people have judged ought to be allowed to die in this way. So that's what makes it a utilitarian or a consequentialist argument against active euthanasia. Okay. We're not going to dwell too much on this next section here. Read this a couple times. I think you'll get the gist. It's actually a pretty clever argument, but there's so many terms flying around this chapter. I did want to say something about it to clarify it, but we're going to focus our attention elsewhere. All right, so let's go down to question 4. Question 4 directs us to read the section entitled "The Argument from a Principle of Avoiding Killing." Some people take it as a basic moral fact that it is wrong to intentionally take an innocent human life. Is this claim grounded in a respect for persons or in consequentialist considerations? Now, the answer to A is that the claim that it is always wrong to take the life of an innocent person has been grounded in the principle of respect for persons. The guiding idea is that human life is sacred, or in religiously neutral language, humans have a level of dignity that makes it intrinsically wrong to take an innocent human life, even if, for example, one was doing it at the patient's request because the patient was terminally ill and they were in great pain that couldn't be relieved. So some have argued, even under those conditions, active euthanasia is morally wrong because it's just a basic moral fact that intentionally killing an innocent person is wrong. All right. Question B says, do you agree or disagree that a physician has the autonomy to not deliberately kill, but does not have the autonomy to not stop treatment at the patient's request? So I'm interested to read your responses. Let me just clarify the significance of the question, though. Um, so if there is a morally significant difference between killing and letting die, then that should come out in our decision making and what we allow people to not only do, but refrain from doing. So if a physician, if we kind of think upon reflection, look, if I'm a doctor, um, at some point, sure, I have to stop treating the patient when the treatment's not effective. That's letting die. That it would just be bad medicine to never stop treating a patient. But there is no moral obligation for me to actively engage in the process of killing a patient. I'm under no obligation to prescribe poison or something like that. Then that does support the view that these two are not basically the same thing. They're morally speaking, there is something different about them. So that's why this is an interesting question. Do you think the physician has the autonomy to refrain from being involved in the deliberate taking of a life? And I hope yeah, hopefully I didn't say it explicitly, but yeah, but why? If you do think that, why do you think that? And just notice the implication would be, okay, there is some sort of morally significant difference here. Okay. Question 5. Read the section entitled New Legal Initiatives for Physician-Assisted Suicide. That section actually goes through a lot of the specific mechanisms by which laws in favor of physician-assisted suicide have been passed. That's not what we focused on, but that is good information to know. So 5A, do you agree or disagree regarding the claim that there is a morally significant distinction between a physician assisting a suicide of a terminally ill patient by prescribing poison and the physician being involved in the administration of the poison. All right. So in A, I basically say, look, this is another question that asks for your response. And then I kind of give my own views there. Um, Both are deliberate acts of killing, whether the doctor is present or prescribes poison ahead of time. Morally speaking, is not a huge concern. Um, but practically speaking, there are good reasons to do it this way. It's easier on the doctor to not have to be present, and it might be better for the reputation of doctors in general, to not be seen as the ones directly administering the poison. All right, so there are these practical benefits for the well-being of the doctor and the reputation of doctors. Um, but as far as the act of killing itself, the means are basically the same, morally speaking. All right, now Dr. Kevorkian, question B, what did Dr. Kevorkian do and what ended up happening to him? Well, he traveled the country for many years with what he called a suicide machine. It was just a way of administering poison that he hooked up to terminally ill patients who requested assistance in dying. Apparently, I have apostrophyitis. I keep adding them and I shouldn't. He helped over 30 people end their life this way. He was brought to trial many times. Many times a jury let him off, but eventually he was convicted and sent to prison. All right, question 6. Read the distinction between direct and indirect killing. Um, that's a section title. Define the doctrine of double effect. And B, according to this doctrine, would there be a morally significant difference between prescribing a lethal dose of morphine in order to relieve a patient's suffering and prescribing a lethal dose for the purpose of killing the patient? And if you go down, the doctrine of double effect states that it is morally permissible to intend a good end, such as reducing a patient's pain, while using means that are known to bring about a bad end, such as killing the patient, as long as the good end is the reason or motive why the action is undertaken. According to this doctrine, this is part B, it would be ethical to prescribe a lethal dose of morphine to relieve the pain of a patient if no non-toxic means could be taken, even if it is highly likely that this will end the patient's life. In contrast, one who holds this doctrine is unlikely to think that using the morphine for the purpose of killing the patient is morally justifiable. So the doctrine of double effect puts a lot of weight on the motive of why an action is undertaken in order to figure out if it's morally acceptable or not. Many patients are in the unfortunate position that the only way they can have effective pain relief is to ingest toxic amounts of drugs like morphine, which is a very powerful painkiller. So the doctors know, the patient knows, look, this is likely to kill you, but that's not why we're doing it. We're doing it to relieve your pain. This is a known side effect. So that's the idea. So it's a, many people have thought this is a plausible way to think about the morality of such cases. The whole point is to relieve pain, not to bring about death, even if one knows that death will result. All right, question 7. Read the distinction between ordinary and extraordinary means. How have bioethicists always defined an ordinary and an extraordinary means? Does the distinction have anything to do with what is common? Now, bioethicists have defined the difference in distinctly moral terms. An ordinary means to keep a patient alive is one that, morally speaking, must be done. An extraordinary means is one that is not morally obligatory. For example, one might think that treating easily fightable infections and delivering food and water, like even intravenously, to the patient is ordinary, whereas using massive amounts of medical resources to briefly prolong a life is extraordinary and therefore not morally obligatory. And this is the way the distinction usually is played out. It's far less controversial that a doctor or a team of physicians, they don't have to do everything possible to save the life of a patient. It's much more morally, the easier the interventions get, though, and the more effective they are, especially when they're easy, then you really need a strong argument that they're not morally obligatory. Um, okay, so I hope this was helpful to you. These are just a lot of distinctions surrounding what is called active and passive euthanasia, and within a population that is aging, these issues will continue to grow in importance. All right. Well, thanks for listening, and I will see you next week. All right.